Welcome to the Emergent Gateway Agri-Tech podcast series called The Grain Revolution, Innovative Storage Solutions for Emerging Markets. I have the pleasure of having with me Ken Pierson, who's a product manager at Meridian. Uh, Ken comes to us with over 40 years of experience in grain storage in North America. Meridian is a $1 billion company that's headquartered in Manitoba in uh, Canada. And Meridian handles all kinds of grain storage and handling solutions. This particular podcast is on distributed storage. Maybe, Ken, a good place to start would be to just chart out the evolution of grain storage in Canada.
Well, good to be with you, Vasant. Back in the earliest days when farmers were harvesting and they did not have on-farm grain storage, made it very difficult because then the grain that couldn't be delivered to the elevator in time was just stored on the ground, and then rodents and bad weather would cause the grain to degrade. So the very first silos that were used on farm to store grain were made out of wood. And then in 1926, the first steel corrugated silos became available to farmers. And became a much more common practice, as the steel silos were great in that they would keep out rodents and also prevent weather damage on the grain versus storing the grain on the ground.
Yep.
About 30 years ago, we started teaching farmers how to do natural air grain drying using 3/4 to 1 CFM per bushel, which gave farmers the advantage of being able to start harvest 10 to 14 days earlier than normal, because back then farmers had to wait until their grain was down to 14% moisture in the field before they could harvest it. Where once they were able to do natural air drying, they could take it off at 18-20%, dry that grain in the grain bin, and that gave them the ability to get an early start on harvest, which in most cases would mean that you're not going to get caught in any ugly weather at the end of harvest either.
Yeah. So contrasting that with the India experience, Ken, just to put that in the India and the emerging market context, uh, India started out with centralized storage rather than distributed storage. You've heard of the Green Revolution in the 50s and the 60s, uh, which kind of revolutionized agriculture in India, prior to which much of the needs of the country were met with imports rather than through domestic production. However, with the Green Revolution, there was a massive increase in production of grain. And since food security was the primary goal of the policymakers, much of the grain storage at that point was centralized, and that has carried through all the way today. So there is an agency called the Food Corporation of India that does this centralized grain storage, uh, either directly or through private players. And between that and what food processors have in terms of centralized storage accounts for much of the storage in the country. And so it's very interesting from an India and an emerging market perspective to see the Canadian model and the Canadian experience and how that has impacted agriculture as a whole, and particularly farmers. From your perspective, how has distributed storage impacted the Canadian farmer?
So the farmers in Canada, they also had the opportunity to haul to centralized storage. But what they found was when they had to sell their crop right at harvest time, everybody was harvesting. There was lots of grain, so the price of grain would drop. And they found that by storing the grain on farm, then until the new year or maybe even the spring, when there wasn't as much grain available on the market, then the elevators here or the distribution centers would pay better money for that grain. And so what the farmers were doing were basically just playing the market, having the ability to hold on to that grain and see if they can't get a better price. That has become so popular in Canada that just about every farmer does that. I mean, every farmer does also contract and has to deliver a certain amount at harvest. But right now in Canada, grain storage on the farm is so popular that we almost have as enough bins on the farms to store the total crop that gets harvested in the fall. I did a fair amount of work over in Australia, which has a similar type of setup where they harvest and then it gets hotter, not colder. And they found too that at that point in time, that would go back to 2000, there was very limited amount of on-farm storage in Australia. And we began showing farmers the advantage of being able to go out there and harvest the grain at a higher moisture, dry it in the bins so they could haul a better grade of wheat. So now in Australia, there's a revolution going on there where they've caught on to this and farmers are putting a lot more on-farm storage on their farms. So number one, they can start harvesting early, and number two, they can play the market and get a better price for their grain in the new year.
Yeah. Relating that to the India and the emerging market context again, Ken, uh, the government in 2016 came up with an objective of doubling farmers' income. And very soon, uh, the government realized, the policymakers realized that without infrastructure near farm, that would be a very difficult road to climb. However, moving from a centralized storage system to a distributed storage system for such a large country with a huge population and where food security is a constant concern has proved to be much more difficult. And that's one of the challenges that India is facing. We are talking to a lot of policymakers at the central and the state level, and not one of them thinks that distributed storage is not the future. They all agree that distributed storage is the future. The difficulty is how to change the direction from the current focus on centralized storage to distributed storage. So, Ken, a good place to wrap up this particular podcast is based on your knowledge of how things evolved in Canada and what you've experienced is reality in India. Uh, what, how can India move from where it is to a more distributed storage model?
Well, one of the things that I've learned over the years is whenever there's a new concept or a new technology, there's certain farmers that look at it and want to get into it right away. There's other farmers that sort of stand back and watch those pioneers, the guys that are willing to try something different to see whether it works or not. And then as it does, then the word spreads and more farmers are doing it. And that's basically what happened in Canada. I mean, even with natural air drying, when I first started teaching farmers about natural air drying, I had university professors tell me that I was crazy and didn't know what I was talking about. And now today, those same professors in their information, they talk about natural air drying. And so I think in India, you're going to have the same thing. You're going to have certain farmers that look at having storage on farm as an advantage. With the natural air drying, they can take the rice a little wetter and dry it down in the bin, giving them a little more control. It's always there's no black and white with natural air drying because it's dependent a little bit upon what the weather does. But when I look at the weather conditions in India after your harvest, you have very favorable conditions. So I think there's a great potential there. But again, it'll be certain farmers that'll take the chance and go out and do it, and then it'll slowly spread from there.
Since we recorded this podcast on distributed storage with Ken Pierson of Meridian, there has been a major development in India. The central government announced an outlay of 1 lakh crore rupees that translates to a little over 13 billion US dollars to implement near farm or distributed storage across the country. The objectives stated were to enhance India's food security, to reduce waste, and to improve farmers' income. It is intended that this initiative will be implemented across the country through cooperatives by starting first with a pilot project in 10 districts across India. This, in effect, reinforces our contention that distributed storage rather than centralized storage is the future for grain storage in India. I would like to thank Ken Pierson for being a part of this podcast. His contribution was invaluable to making this useful. And thank you to all of you, the audience, for continuing to view our podcast. Stay tuned for the next podcast coming up. Thank you.